Nobody walking into Strasbourg thought this match would become one of the most emotional stories of the entire clay court season. On the surface, it looked simple. Alex Ila preparing for French Open with one final tune-up tournament. A rising top, 40 player sharpening her game before Paris. Across the net stood a qualifier few casual fans knew much about. Another dangerous clay specialist trying to survive another round. But underneath the scoreline, there was a completely different story unfolding. A story tied to war, separation, sacrifice, and a father who had spent nearly 2 years away from his daughter while defending his country. That is what made this match feel different from the very beginning. After the match, Alexandra Oleinikova revealed the emotional reality she had been carrying into Strasbourg. Her father serves in the Ukrainian military. Before the war intensified, he had regularly attended her tournaments and supported her career in person. Then everything changed. Tennis became secondary to survival and national defense. The last time he had watched her compete live was back in the summer of 2024 before returning to military duty. For nearly 2 years, there were no courtside reunions. No normal family routines. No guarantee about when they would even see each other again. Then suddenly, before Strasbourg, he received a short break from the front lines. 2 weeks. And instead of resting quietly at home, he traveled to France to watch his daughter play tennis again. That changes the emotional temperature of every moment on court. Because while fans were analyzing rankings and clay court statistics, Oleinikova was carrying something much heavier emotionally. She was competing in front of her father knowing he would soon return to war once the break ended. Every point suddenly carried emotional urgency far beyond tennis strategy or ranking points. And honestly, once you understand that context, the intensity of her performance starts making far more sense. She played like someone refusing to waste a single opportunity. Even when momentum shifted toward Ila, she kept fighting. Even when the crowd leaned toward the higher-ranked Filipina, she stayed composed. And late in the match, when pressure tightened around every rally, Oleinikova looked mentally fearless. That emotional clarity can become incredibly powerful in sports. Sometimes athletes stop fearing failure when they realize the moment means more than the scoreboard itself. The pressure changes shape completely. Winning becomes personal. Competing becomes emotional release. And suddenly players find another gear they did not even know they had. That is part of what the tennis world struggled to process afterward. Because this was not simply a bad loss for Ila or a random upset from a qualifier. It was two very different emotional journeys colliding on the same court at the same moment in time. On one side stood Ila, one of the brightest young stars in international tennis, trying to build momentum before the biggest clay tournament in the world. She entered Strasbourg chasing battle-tested preparation, choosing difficult competition instead of easy confidence-building wins elsewhere. That decision reflected ambition and maturity. On the other side stood a Ukrainian player carrying years of emotional weight tied directly to war and family separation. That combination created a match far more intense than most people expected. And honestly, the atmosphere around the contest reportedly reflected that emotion. Fans could feel the urgency from both players. Long rallies carried extra tension. Momentum swings felt dramatic. Every hold of serve mattered. Then came the final stages of the match, where Oleinikova refused to break mentally. Afterward, she explained that during the deciding set she told herself to relax and simply fight for every point because she was already proud of the performance regardless of the outcome. That mindset became critical. Instead of tightening under pressure, she started swinging more freely and trusting her game. That is often what separates close matches on clay. Not raw power, not rankings, mental freedom. And suddenly the qualifier nobody expected to survive the round closed out one of the most emotionally charged victories of her career. Meanwhile, Ila left Strasbourg with disappointment, but also with another important learning experience before Paris. Because this is the brutal reality of professional tennis that rankings never fully explain. By the time clay season reaches late May, qualifiers are often incredibly dangerous. They already have rhythm. They already understand the court conditions. And emotionally, they sometimes arrive playing with absolutely nothing to lose. Add personal motivation connected to family sacrifice and wartime emotion, and you no longer have a simple first-round match. You have a human story bigger than sports itself. That is why people inside the tennis world kept talking about Strasbourg long after the match ended. Not because of controversy. Not because of drama manufactured for headlines. But because for a few hours on a clay court in France, tennis became connected to something painfully real happening far beyond the stadium walls. Knowing her father would finally be sitting in the stands changed everything for Alexandra Olenikova before that match in Strasbourg even started. She admitted later that the emotions were almost impossible to control. For nearly 2 years, her life had been divided between professional tennis and the reality of war back home in Ukraine. Every tournament came with distance. Every victory happened far away from family. Every loss ended without the people closest to her there in person. Then suddenly, after months on the front lines, her father was able to travel to France during a short military break. Imagine carrying that into a tennis match. Every warm-up shot feels heavier. Every glance toward the crowd becomes emotional. Every point suddenly matters more because somebody you feared you might not see again is finally watching you compete in person. She openly admitted she kept thinking about it before the match. Not because it distracted her, but because the moment felt overwhelming in the deepest possible way. She even talked about trying to extend her schedule long enough for him to watch another match before he had to return again. That alone tells you how personal the week had become. But while that emotional story was unfolding on one side of the net, another major story was building on the other side with Alex Ila. And in many ways, her rise during the 2026 season has become one of the biggest breakout stories in all of women's tennis. Because what fans are seeing now did not appear overnight. Long before television cameras started following her around major tournaments, Ila had already spent years building quietly through smaller events, learning how to survive the grind of professional tennis. She developed through the ITF circuit, challenger tournaments, long travel schedules, smaller crowds, and difficult losses that casual fans never saw. That hidden development stage matters because it created the foundation for what is happening now. At the Rafa Nadal Academy, she sharpened the kind of patient clay court discipline that many younger players struggle to develop. Her game was never built entirely around overwhelming power. Instead, coaches focused on movement, court awareness, shot tolerance, angles, and emotional control under pressure. Those traits do not always create instant headlines, but they build players capable of lasting at the highest level. By the start of 2026, the work was finally becoming visible to the entire tennis world. Her run in Auckland changed perceptions immediately. Reaching the semifinals was not simply a nice result. It became a historic breakthrough for Philippine tennis. When Ila entered the WTA Top 50, she became the first Filipino woman ever to reach that level in the modern era of professional tennis. That moment alone would have been enough to define a career for many players. But what came next may have mattered even more. She kept winning. And as she kept winning, something unusual started happening around her matches. The crowds changed. The energy changed. Fans who had barely heard her name months earlier suddenly began showing up wearing Philippine colors. Online engagement exploded. International media started covering her tournaments differently. Stadiums that once treated her as an underdog qualifier began reacting to her like a featured attraction. You could feel a genuine movement building around her season. That kind of rise rarely happens by accident in global tennis. Fans respond when they sense authenticity, resilience, and real growth. Ila's appeal was not manufactured through hype alone. People were watching an athlete improve almost in real time against stronger competition every month. And perhaps most importantly, audiences connected emotionally to how she competed. She fought for points. She stayed composed after mistakes. She carried herself with maturity beyond her age. Even in defeats against elite opponents, she continued looking like someone capable of eventually breaking through at the very top of the sport. That is why the atmosphere around her matches began feeling different midway through the season. At first, she was simply a promising young player from the Philippines. Then gradually, she became something larger, a symbol of possibility for an entire region that rarely produces major stars in women's tennis. By the time she arrived in Europe for the clay season, fans were no longer asking whether she belonged on the WTA Tour. They were asking how high she could climb. And that is what made the Strasbourg match emotionally fascinating from both directions. On one side stood a Ukrainian player fueled by family sacrifice, war, and the emotional reality of finally competing in front of her father again. On the other side stood one of the fastest rising young stars in international tennis, carrying the expectations of a rapidly growing fan base and a historic season that had transformed her career in only a few months. Those two stories collided on the same court. That is why people kept talking about the match afterward. Because sometimes sports stop feeling like entertainment for a few hours and start revealing something much deeper about pressure, identity, sacrifice, and ambition.